You know, she took husbands like Hitler going through Poland, don't you think? I mean...
They were Hollywood royalty and best friends. But one betrayal changed everything. And for decades, Debbie Reynolds never revealed the full truth. At 88, she finally broke her silence. And what she said about Elizabeth Taylor stunned everyone. Before the betrayal, before the headlines, there was something few people remember. A friendship that seemed unshakable. Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor were not just movie stars, they were young mothers, rising icons, and, for a time, inseparable friends. The kind who laughed on set, shared parenting advice, and leaned on each other as they navigated a brutal, male-dominated industry. Their bond began in the late 1940s on the polished lots of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer. Debbie was the bubbly newcomer with girl-next-door charm. Elizabeth, already a screen legend, carried herself with quiet confidence. Beneath the surface, they connected over something deeper, the shared loneliness of fame. They were both shaped by the MGM system, which controlled everything from their on-screen roles to their public images. Debbie, the wholesome sweetheart. Elizabeth, the smoldering beauty. Yet behind the studio's polished branding, they were simply two young women trying to stay grounded. When Debbie married singer Eddie Fisher in 1955, Elizabeth stood by her side, literally. Their families vacationed together, their children played together, and from the outside, they looked like the perfect trio, Hollywood's golden couple and their glamorous best friend. Debbie never imagined the woman she trusted most would become the reason her world unraveled. But that day had not come yet. In those early years, their bond felt almost sisterly. They celebrated each other's wins and comforted each other through failures. Debbie once said, Elizabeth was the most beautiful woman she had ever seen. But more than that, she admired her strength. The public loved their friendship. Magazine covers showed them smiling arm in arm. Studio publicists turned it into a selling point. Two beloved stars bonded by fame and family. But even the most golden friendships can hide hairline cracks. And those cracks would soon split wide open by one unimaginable betrayal. By the mid-1950s, Debbie Reynolds and Eddie Fisher were America's sweethearts. She was the wholesome girl next door. He was the smooth-voiced crooner. Their marriage seemed like a fairy tale. And standing close by was Elizabeth Taylor, Debbie's best friend and one of the most famous actresses in the world. But in March of 1958, tragedy struck. Elizabeth's husband, producer Mike Todd, died in a plane crash. He had been the love of her life. The loss shattered her. Eddie, who had been Mike's close friend, rushed to comfort her. At first, it seemed natural. Elizabeth was grieving. The families were close. But behind closed doors, something else was happening. Debbie began to notice the signs. Late-night calls, Eddie's distance, stories that did not add up. And then, the truth broke. Not in a conversation, but in the tabloids. Eddie Fisher was having an affair with Elizabeth Taylor. The press had a field day. Headlines screamed betrayal. Debbie was left to face the cameras, the questions, and the silence, all while raising two young children. And through it all, she was expected to keep smiling. What most people never saw was the pressure behind the scenes. Debbie was under contract with MGM, which told her to stay quiet and act gracious. Elizabeth Taylor was still a prized asset. Executives did not want a war between two of their biggest stars. They wanted the scandal controlled, even if that meant silencing the woman who had been hurt most. Publicly, Debbie kept her composure. She gave carefully worded statements and wished the couple well. Privately, she was devastated. Elizabeth never reached out. There was no apology, just betrayal and silence. In 1959, Eddie officially divorced Debbie and married Elizabeth just hours later. It was a media circus, but the public did not buy the fairy tale. They saw Eddie's decision for what it was, and they turned on him. Still, the full story remained hidden. Debbie kept the truth locked away for years. She had been told to move on, so she did. But decades later, when she was finally free to speak, what she revealed was deeper and more human than anything the headlines ever captured. In 1959, Debbie Reynolds stood in the middle of a media storm, betrayed by her best friend, abandoned by her husband, and expected to smile through it all. But the silence was not just a personal choice. it was enforced. Debbie was under contract with Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, a studio that controlled every aspect of its stars' lives. Her public image was their product, sweet, innocent, scandal-free. And when the scandal hit, studio executives made their priorities clear: protect Elizabeth Taylor, their box office queen, and keep Debbie quiet. She was told that speaking out would damage her career. So, while the tabloids feasted, Debbie had to maintain the illusion. Publicly graceful, privately devastated. Even her public statements were filtered through studio advisors, polished, emotionless, and deliberately restrained. Debbie later admitted that the pressure was overwhelming. Her husband had walked out, her children were confused, and the friend she trusted most had disappeared. What hurt the most was losing Elizabeth. That friendship had been real, and when it ended, no one gave her the space to grieve it. Debbie swallowed that pain because the industry expected her to. Years later, once the studio grip had loosened, Debbie began to speak more freely. She described the crushing loneliness, the surreal experience of watching the world celebrate a romance that destroyed her family, and the pressure to keep smiling through it all. Still, she never lashed out. Her voice remained calm, but her words hit hard. "Back then," she said, "you did not talk. You smiled. You moved on. Or you lost everything." She chose to survive, to protect her children, her name, and her ability to keep working in a town that punished women for being honest. But eventually, she broke that silence. And when she did, she told a version of the story the world had never heard, raw, human, and her own. For decades, Debbie Reynolds kept the real story locked behind smiles and carefully worded interviews. But as she grew older, more independent, more secure, she began to open up. And what she shared was far more raw and personal than anyone expected. In her memoir and late-life interviews, Debbie did not just revisit the betrayal. She broke it down, calmly, honestly, and without bitterness. She revealed she had not heard about the affair from Eddie or Elizabeth, but from the press. The rumors had been building, the late-night calls, the sudden distance, the emotional coldness, but when it hit the headlines, it still felt like a blindside. What stunned her most was not just Eddie walking out. It was Elizabeth stepping into her life without hesitation. There was no apology, no explanation. Debbie called it a kind of emotional death. Not loud, not dramatic, just complete absence. She later described the moment Eddie told her it was over. He called her while she was at work, said he would not be coming home, and that was it. He moved out, moved on. Married Elizabeth within weeks. The phone call's cold finality stayed with Debbie forever. But what cut even deeper was Elizabeth's silence. Debbie said she might have forgiven her friend, in time, if she had simply come to her, face to face, and apologized. But that never happened. Not at the time. And when regret finally surfaced, it came filtered, shaped more by distance than remorse. Debbie spoke about the isolation that followed. Suddenly, a single mother, she had to act like everything was fine, while the public romanticized her heartbreak. She had to smile for producers, explain the situation to her children, and pose for cameras that captured her face, but not her pain. Still, she endured, not with anger, but with resilience. She poured herself into work, into performing, into building something lasting. And she did. Debbie outlasted the scandal, the affair, and even the careers of those who had wounded her. While Eddie faded and Elizabeth cycled through marriages, Debbie kept going. When asked how she survived it all, she gave a simple answer: you keep walking. Because if you stop, they win. Her story resonated not because it was scandalous, but because it was dignified. In a time when women were often told to bury their pain, Debbie chose to speak hers aloud, calmly, clearly, without shame. And just when it seemed like the past was finally behind her, life brought one more twist, an unexpected encounter that no one saw coming. After years of silence, pain, and emotional distance, no one expected Debbie Reynolds and Elizabeth Taylor to ever reconnect, let alone speak. But fate had a different plan. Their unexpected reunion did not happen at a Hollywood event, but on a cruise ship, miles away from the spotlight. Decades after the betrayal, both women had unknowingly booked cabins on the same voyage. Debbie was walking through one of the ship's hallways when she saw a familiar face, Elizabeth. They froze, shared an awkward pause, and then, to their own surprise, they laughed. It was not a grand moment of forgiveness, but something shifted. Time had softened their edges. They were no longer rivals, but older women who had both endured decades of spotlight, scandal, and loss. Debbie later said she made the first move, not because she forgot what had happened, but because she was tired of carrying it. She walked over, said hello, and invited Elizabeth to lunch. No headlines, no cameras, just a quiet conversation. They talked for hours about their children, aging, fame, the strange loneliness behind their public lives. Elizabeth did not offer a sweeping apology, but she acknowledged the past, and that mattered. Forgiveness did not arrive all at once, but it started there, with coffee, laughter, and shared survival. It was not the friendship they once had, but it was something new, grounded, respectful, human. In the years that followed, they reconnected slowly. Charity events, award shows, the occasional photo together. Debbie once joked their reconciliation was proof that anything is possible, even the impossible. Still, Debbie admitted the wounds never fully healed. She could forgive, but she could not forget. Some things remained unspoken. Old pain, quiet memories, questions never answered. But the bitterness was gone. Only history remained. Their quiet truce defied the drama Hollywood often demanded. There were no public confessions or staged reunions, just two women who had been through fire and came out changed, but still standing. And for Debbie, that was enough. But as she finally laid the past to rest, someone else, the man who caused it all, was quietly unraveling in the background. In the swirl of betrayal and scandal, one name slowly faded into the background: Eddie Fisher. Once a household name and chart-topping singer, he ended up remembered not as a romantic lead, but as the man who lost everything. While Debbie and Elizabeth became legends, Eddie became a warning. When Eddie left Debbie for Elizabeth Taylor, he underestimated the cost. In the 1950s, public image meant everything. Debbie was the betrayed mother, the innocent star. Elizabeth, the grieving widow turned scandal icon. But Eddie? He had no comeback story. His fall was immediate. Sponsors vanished. Fans turned away. His television show was canceled, and his once flourishing music career dried up. Back then, the public did not just watch, they judged. And Eddie was judged harshly. Later in life, Eddie admitted that marrying Elizabeth was the worst decision of his career, not just because it ended his stardom, but because their relationship crumbled almost as quickly as it began. Elizabeth left him for Richard Burton, starting yet another infamous love affair. Eddie was left alone, professionally discarded and publicly humiliated. Meanwhile, Debbie kept rising. She found success on stage and screen, rebuilt her brand, and raised her children with grace. She became a symbol of strength, a woman who endured scandal and came out stronger, more admired than ever. Eddie, on the other hand, spent the rest of his life in the shadow of that one decision. In interviews and in his memoir, he tried to explain himself, blaming fame, impulsiveness, even loneliness. But regret always clung to his words. He knew what he had thrown away, not just a marriage, but the image of a devoted husband and father. Debbie rarely spoke of him with anger. In later years, she summed it up with calm detachment. Eddie was Eddie. He did what he did, and I had a life to live. There was no need for revenge. The world had already made its judgment. What makes Eddie's story so haunting is how completely he disappeared. While Elizabeth became a cultural icon and Debbie earned standing ovations into her 70s, Eddie's name slipped into obscurity. He died in 2010 at the age of 82, mostly forgotten, except by those who remembered how quickly fame can vanish when trust is broken. And while Debbie moved on, healed, and forgave, she had one final truth to share before her story ended, a truth that brought everything full circle. By the time Debbie Reynolds reached her late 80s, she had become something greater than a Hollywood star. She was a survivor in the truest sense, a woman who endured heartbreak, public betrayal, career upheaval, and the challenges of motherhood in an unforgiving industry, yet never lost her grace. In her final years, Debbie began speaking more openly about the betrayal that had once dominated headlines. But this time, there was no sting, no bitterness, just clarity. She shared her story not for sympathy, but because the lessons still mattered, especially for women in the industry, and for anyone who had been hurt by someone they trusted. She said betrayal had taught her that forgiveness was not forgetting. It was choosing to move forward without letting anger control you. It did not mean pretending it had not hurt, just that the pain would no longer lead the way. Debbie admitted it took years to reach that place. Early on, she had questioned herself. Had she been too focused on work, too trusting? But in time, she saw the truth. It was never about her. People make choices, she said, and sometimes those choices have nothing to do with you, even when they hurt you the most. Her honesty resonated. She became a kind of emotional historian, someone who had lived through Hollywood's brightest and darkest moments and could now speak freely about what really went on behind the scenes. She talked about the pressure to conform, to smile through pain, to protect reputations that did not deserve it. But through it all, she never let the system change who she was. Debbie also opened up more about motherhood, especially her relationship with her daughter, Carrie Fisher. Their bond had long been complex, filled with love and tension. Carrie, who was open about her struggles with mental health and addiction, often clashed with her mother's perfectionist streak. But over time, that tension evolved into understanding. They began touring together, sharing stages and stories, writing about their dynamic with both humor and heartbreak. Debbie once said that the greatest joy of her later years was becoming close with Carrie, in a way that felt real, not just as mother and daughter, but as two women who had survived fame and its shadows. That closeness gave Debbie peace. She knew she had made mistakes, but also that her choices were rooted in love. More than anything, she wanted to be remembered for her strength, not for scandal. When she looked back on the affair that once defined her in gossip columns, she no longer saw it as her defining moment. It was just one chapter. What defined her was what came after: the rebuilding, the rising, the refusal to let anyone else write her ending. She wanted people to know that pain does not have to be permanent, that betrayal does not mean you are broken, and that even in a world as harsh as Hollywood, you can keep your soul if you fight for it. In December of 2016, Debbie Reynolds was preparing for what should have been just another quiet holiday. But nothing that year had gone according to plan. Just one day earlier, her daughter, Carrie Fisher, had passed away unexpectedly after a medical emergency aboard a flight. The news had sent shockwaves through Hollywood and across the world. Carrie, the fiercely witty, brutally honest, iconic actress best known as Princess Leia, was gone at the age of 60. Debbie was devastated. In her final public appearances, she had spoken often of her daughter with deep love and pride. Their relationship had never been simple, but it had grown into something powerful, a bond forged in fire. They had survived the glare of the spotlight, the sting of mental illness, addiction, and the emotional baggage of fame. And in the end, they had come through it closer than ever. So when Debbie received the news that Carrie was gone, something shifted inside her. According to her son, Todd Fisher, Debbie sat quietly for a moment and then said just 5 words: "I want to be with Carrie." Hours later, she suffered a stroke. The next day, she was gone. Hollywood mourned the loss of both women, stunned by the timing, a mother and daughter, leaving the world just 24 hours apart. But for those who knew their story, it felt strangely fitting. In life, they had walked through fire together. In death, they refused to be separated. At her memorial, friends and fans celebrated not just Debbie's work, but her legacy, one built not on scandal, but on strength. She had lived through betrayal, heartbreak, the collapse of a marriage, and the collapse of an industry that once tried to silence her. And still, she never stopped giving to her audience, to her family, to the world that had not always been kind to her. Debbie left behind more than just a filmography. She left behind a blueprint for surviving the unthinkable. She taught the world that dignity matters, that forgiveness is not weakness, and that sometimes the best revenge is to outlast the ones who tried to break you. As for Elizabeth Taylor, she had passed away 5 years earlier, in 2011. In her final years, she and Debbie remained in touch, if not close. There were no grand reconciliations, no public declarations of friendship, but there was peace. And perhaps, in a world as dramatic as theirs, that was the best ending they could hope for. What Debbie Reynolds exposed at 88 was not just a betrayal, but a truth that even in the brightest lights of fame, real pain still cuts deep. That sometimes the people who hurt you are the ones you once loved the most. And that silence, when it is finally broken, can echo louder than any scandal ever did. Her story is not just a Hollywood tale, it is a human one, about heartbreak, survival, and the quiet, defiant power of telling your own story, even if it takes a lifetime to do it.